Well, hey everybody, good morning to you. Happy Sunday to you. Happy final Sunday of June to you. If you got a Bible, I'd love for you to open it up to the 50th chapter of the final book, the first book of the Bible, the final chapter there, Genesis chapter 50. There's just a few verses for us to read through here, and then we'll talk about them. Genesis 50, beginning in verse 15, says this. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of your servants, of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves before him. "We're your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what's now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I'll provide for you and your children." And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. We've been in a series called No Ordinary Joe. We're wrapping it up today, and we've been looking at the life of one of the most incredible stories in the Bible. It's the life of Joseph. And this is the end of Joseph's story here in chapter 50 of Genesis. And in many ways, it looks back. It recaps the rest of the story, which is why we're looking at it today. And this is such an important story for us to understand. For instance, why is Joseph weeping here? Verse 17 says, Joseph weeps. Why does he weep? Well, part of why Joseph wept is because what we just read, the message that Joseph's brothers sent to Joseph, it was a lie. It wasn't true. See, the brothers, now that Jacob was dead, they're thinking that Joseph would now punish them or kill them for, all the wrongs that they had done. And so they fabricate the story that Jacob, before he dies, says, "Hey, send this message to my son Joseph. Joseph, don't you lay a hand on any of the hairs of the heads of my sons, my other sons, your brothers. Don't touch them." And again, that's a lie. Jacob never said that. The brothers just made it up because they were scared. They didn't understand Joseph's true heart. They didn't understand how he had changed. They didn't understand how different Joseph was. And so it was a lie. And what were, as verse 15 says, all those wrongs that they committed? And if you've been here the last few weeks, but just to make sure we're up to speed, let me sum it all up here. If we go back to chapter 37 of Genesis, where Joseph's story begins, we meet a 17-year-old Joseph, a young Joseph, and Jacob, the father, he loved Joseph more than any of the others. He plays favorites there, and Joseph was his favorite. And he telegraphed that to everybody by, among other things, giving Joseph a fancy ornamented coat of many colors. And what that favoritism did is it poisoned the family. And because of it, the brothers hated him. But that favoritism also poisoned Joseph because he had these dreams where God seemed to be saying to him, hey, all the rest of his family, his mom and dad, his brothers, they were all going to one day bow down to Joseph. The dreams say that he was going to rule over his family. And because Joseph is spoiled and Joseph is arrogant at this point in time, he's immature, he gloats about it. And he's quick to share those dreams with the rest of his family. And he kind of rubs their nose in it and he aggravates them all with it. And so with that favoritism, Joseph at 17 is just a fancy coat-wearing, dream-sharing, spoiled punk. That's who Joseph is. The whole family had been poisoned. Well, his brothers, they end up having this opportunity where they're way out in a remote area called Dothan, and they're working, and Jacob sends Joseph to check up on his brothers, and when they see Joseph coming, they say, "Let's kill him." And so they seize him, and they strip him of that coat, and then they throw him into an empty water cistern where they're going to leave him to die there. And then after they throw him in that empty cistern, they callously kind of sit down to eat. Well, while they're eating lunch, some traveling merchants, some Ishmaelites, the Midianite merchants, they come traveling through, and Judah who's the ringleader. He kind of had the hardest heart at the time. He says to the other brothers, he says, why kill him and get nothing for it? Let's get something for him. Let's sell him. And so that's what they do. They sold him to the Ishmaelites into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. Then they take that coat, they smear some goat's blood on it, they take it back to their father, and they say, hey, is this the coat of your son? And Jacob concludes that Joseph has died. Meanwhile, Joseph, even though he's sold as a teenage foreign slave into Egypt, he rises up to a place of tremendous honor. God orchestrates things in such an incredible way to allow Joseph to ascend to the second in command in Egypt, who was the world superpower at the time. And it's fascinating how all that happens. Like if you missed either of the last 2 weeks where we talked at length about that part of Joseph's story, you should go back, you should check it out, you should listen to it, and you should stop missing church, okay? But the key is that because of Joseph's wisdom and his insight and because of his incredible administrative abilities and because God is always working, well, he becomes the prime minister of Egypt, essentially. The Pharaoh raises him up to this, high command position, second in command. Pharaoh gives him the royal ring, takes the ring off his own finger, places it on Joseph's finger, and Pharaoh gives Joseph a beautiful robe, which is fascinating. It's interesting as well, given what we know. And Pharaoh even gave Joseph his daughter in marriage. And so in other words, Joseph has the authority of the king, and he has the beauty of the king, and he's even in the family of the king. And Joseph, he ruled Egypt, and he ends up saving Egypt and the entire region from an absolute disaster because Egypt had a famine. Like the whole region had a famine because of a drought, and through Joseph's leadership, he had Egypt prepared and had their storehouses full of grain. And people's lives were saved, all because, through God's providence, he had come to a place of power and authority, Joseph had, and he used that position in the wisest of ways. And then in chapter 42, Jacob and his whole family and all his people, they're starving north of Egypt up there, and they hear that there's food in Egypt. And so Jacob sends his sons, the rest of his sons, except for Benjamin, who is the youngest son now, and he is now the favorite son as well. He sends all the rest of his sons, all 10 of them, to Egypt to get grain. And when they come, they actually bow down before Joseph. They don't recognize Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph. They don't know it's their brother because it's been about 20 years, but he recognizes them. And then what happens is fascinating from there. Because over about a 2-year period, we see Joseph, who doesn't reveal who he is to them at this point in time, he puts his brothers through a series of tests. And the first thing he says to them is he says, you're not brothers, you're spies. You're here to spy out our land. You're here to see where we're vulnerable, and then you're going to go attack us. And they say, no, that's not true. We are brothers. We really are. We're not soldiers. We're not spies. We're brothers. We have a father. We have one dead brother. We have another young brother back home with our father. And Joseph says, you lie. You sit on a throne of lies. You smell like beef and cheese. You lie. And he throws them all into prison, all right? But the next morning, Joseph opens up the prison and he says, hey, I'm a fair man. I'll give you a chance to prove yourself. I'll give you some grain so you're not going to starve, and I'll send you back home with that food. But you got to leave one of the brothers here. I'm going to keep one with me. And don't come back unless you bring your youngest brother that you told me about back with you. Don't come back, which means they'll starve if they don't come back, unless you bring him back with you, and that'll prove that your story is true. And so Joseph takes one of the brothers, Simeon, he throws him into prison, and then this is very interesting because he loads the rest of them up so abundantly with grain. And he secretly takes their silver. They had brought silver to pay and buy grain there in Egypt, but he secretly takes that silver and has his servants pack it back into their sacks. And he gives them provisions for their journey home, and he sends them on their way. And they start making their way home, and when they stop for the first place where they're going to stay overnight, because it's a long way from where they are, they discover the silver, and it freaks them out. It scares them to death. They think they're in trouble. They don't understand it. But eventually they arrive back home to their father Jacob, and they tell him everything. They say Simeon's in prison. He's being held. And it tells him about the request to bring Benjamin back with him. And Jacob says, no way, not going to happen. You are not going to take Benjamin down to Egypt. He says, Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin away from me? Not going to happen. No way. And for 2 years, he won't let them take Benjamin to Egypt. And for 2 years, they somehow survive. Shows the abundance of what Joseph sent them back with. But for 2 years, the brothers are kind of wondering what all this stuff means until finally, they go back to their father Jacob and they say, listen, we're going to die if we don't go back. We have to take Benjamin and we have to go back, get Simeon, and get food from Egypt. And Jacob, of course, in tremendous fear and anger, well, he lets Benjamin go. He has no choice. And so they make their way back to Egypt. This is chapter 43 of Genesis. And Joseph, they're there before Joseph. And Joseph sees them there, and he sees Benjamin. It actually tears him up. He has to run out of the room. He weeps, and he cleans himself up, comes back in, and he says to them, okay, all right, this proves that you're telling me the truth. So I'm going to let Simeon out of prison, and tomorrow we're going to have a big feast. And the next day, they do. They have a big feast, a huge feast, at the royal table, at Joseph's table. And check this out. Joseph arranges the seating chart for his brothers, again, they don't know who he is right now, but he arranges it from oldest to youngest, which completely freaks them out that this prime minister, this powerful, powerful man, seems to know them, knows their ages, knows them so well. But he arranges them oldest to youngest, and the youngest, Benjamin, he has 5 times the amount. That's what he's given. His portion is 5 times more than anybody else's. So after the feast, they all get loaded up to go back home. Joseph makes sure that they're all packed to the gills with grain. And he makes sure once again that they have their silver. They came to buy grain, but he packs their silver secretly into their sacks. And he has someone plant his silver cup. He takes his silver cup and he plants it in Benjamin's sack. They don't know it, but he plants it there. And so they get their grain and they're on their way home, and a messenger comes riding up behind them. And he says, hey, you guys got to stop right there. It says, somebody stole our master's cup. Can you believe it? The nerve, the ingratitude. Someone stole from the feast. Someone stole our master's silver cup. And the brothers are all like, no way, not us. You got the wrong guys. No way we do something like that. And one of them, we don't know who it is, but one of them says, if you find the cup in any of our sacks, then that one will die and the rest of us will become your slaves. Well, they start going through the sacks. So they get to Benjamin's sack, and sure enough, there's the silver cup. And all the brothers are just despondent. I mean, they tear their clothes in anguish, They are brought back to Egypt. They stand again before Joseph. And Joseph says, far be it from me to do what you said, to kill the one and make the rest of them slaves. Nope, not going to do that. Just the one who stole it. He's the slave now. He stays. The rest of you could be on your way. And at that point, Judah stands up. Remember Judah? The one with the hardest heart. Back 20-some years ago, 22 years ago now, when they sold Joseph into slavery, the one who threw him in the pit, Judah stands up and he pleads with Joseph. And he offers another possible solution. And this is so important for us to understand. We got to understand this. See, something's happened in the brothers, maybe especially to Judah. Something's happened since they sold Joseph into slavery for 20 pieces of silver 22 years ago. And one commentator, he says it this way. He says, like the judgment of Solomon, the sudden threat to Benjamin was a thrust to the heart. And in a moment, the brothers stood revealed. All the conditions were present for another betrayal at a far more compelling price, not silver, but their own liberty. And I don't want us to miss this. See, what's happening here, one more time, their father has a favorite. And one more time, if they sell the favorite into slavery, they get something. Just like they got rid of the favorite 22 years ago and had some silver to show for it, now they can get rid of the favorite and have their freedom to show for it. They are practically in the exact same position they were in 22 years ago. But see, especially the last 2 years, something's been going on in them. All this back and forth, the mystery with this powerful prime minister of Egypt who seems to bless them, but yet is testing them, seems to know them so well. All the confusion, all of that. And Judah, the ringleader, the one with the hardest heart before. Here's what he says to Joseph. If the boy is not with us, his father, whose life is bound up with the boy's life, when he sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Now then, please let me remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. And at that very point, it is no accident that it happens at this very point right here. Joseph looks at him. He has everybody leave the room. So everybody leaves. It's just he and his brothers at this point. And what are his brothers expecting right now? I mean, they're expecting the worst. They're expecting to get what they deserve and what they knew they deserved all these years from what they did to Joseph so long ago. They expect judgment and punishment. They are expecting the worst. They expect Joseph to say at this point in time, now off with your heads, or whatever. But instead, Joseph, right then and there at that point in time, he reveals who he really is. He says, it's me, it's Joseph, it's your brother. How's our father doing? See, what we see in these brothers here, God's been working on them too. But we see that they've changed. Joseph has changed for sure, right? He's gone from being a petulant, arrogant, spoiled favorite son, flaunting his favoritism before everybody else in the family, to being a humble yet discerning, accomplished servant leader, full of integrity, who walks with God and can see God's leading in his life and beyond his life. Joseph has changed, no doubt about it. But so have his brothers. And so in the end, Judah says at this point, not what he originally said to Joseph 22 years before, not the kid's life so I can have something, but instead Judah says, my life so the boy can go free. Me for him. I'll take his place. I'll take the punishment that he deserves so that he can go on and live. Judah had completely changed. And at that very point, Joseph could reveal who he really was and say, well, it's me, it's your brother, it's Joseph. So what do we learn from all this, CCC? It's a fascinating story, isn't it? It's an incredible story. It's a story of betrayal. It's a story of disappointment. It's a story of integrity. It's a story of God working behind the scenes in hidden ways. It's a story of change. But for sure, it's a story of forgiveness. See, Joseph's forgiveness, like he's worked through it. I'm sure it took some time. But Joseph forgiving his brothers, doing the hard work of forgiveness, it paves the road for this poisoned family to change. All those patterns of hate and deception and favoritism and just cold, cruel vengefulness, all those patterns have a shot at changing because of Joseph walking in the way of forgiveness. Walter Brueggemann, in his commentary, he says this: what does the enigmatic response of Joseph mean? It means the cycle may be broken. Betrayal and hurts in the family are not easily overcome. They have lingering power. But like every family, these brothers know that the only one who can break the cycle and banish the guilt is the wronged party. Joseph's forgiveness, it breaks the cycle. And the fact of the matter is, he forgave them before they ever repented. You understand? He's forgiven them from the word go, Forgiveness is given to the brothers before forgiveness is ever felt by the brothers. And he puts them through all this back and forth, not because he's being vengeful in some sort of way, but because he's trying to move them to where he is. He's forgiven them already. He sees how God has dealt with him. He understands God's movement in his life. He understands God's movement in the world. And he wants his brothers to get there too. And see, Judah eventually becomes the same pattern that Joseph had become, which is the same pattern we see all throughout the Bible. We see it all over the place in the Bible, and we should be looking for this pattern when we read the Bible. This should be a lens through which we read the Bible. See, Joseph saved his family not in spite of the rejection and betrayal and all that, but through it. If they hadn't sold him into slavery, if they hadn't tried to kill him, if all those things hadn't happened, well, everybody would be dead now. And Joseph knows it, that this is the way of God. He works through this, you see. But see, Joseph didn't just become a savior of sorts for his family by simply being sold into slavery and all those things happening to him. He became a savior of sorts because in that slavery, he died to his own liberty, and he died to his own vengefulness, and he died to his own self-preservation, and he forgives them. Because that's the way of God. It's the opposite of the way of the world, which says, your life for mine, you serve me, you for me, as opposed to the way of God, which says, my life for yours. I'll take the suffering, I'll take the punishment that you deserve so that you can go free. Me for you. You see, this whole story, gang, this whole story, it's really not about Joseph mainly, is it? It's not primarily a story about Joseph. Who's it about? Like, I know this is a church, right? And like Jesus is usually the right answer no matter what in a church, but it's really the right answer here, okay? Who's it mainly about? It points to Jesus. Joseph's story points not just to God in general, but to Jesus in particular. Because just like Joseph, Jesus had his clothes ripped from his body and divided up. And just like Joseph, Jesus was betrayed by those closest to him. And just like Joseph, Jesus was sold over to be a prisoner, sold for a bag of silver. And just like Joseph, Jesus was thrown into prison, unfairly accused, arrested on some trumped up charges. And just like Joseph, Jesus went alone into a foreign land and suffered by himself in order to make a way for everyone to be saved. One suffered so that everyone could be redeemed. And just like Joseph, Jesus forgave those before him that were guilty of so much of his suffering. When Jesus is on the cross, he looks down, he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And he wants to recreate the life in God, that pattern from God, the way of God in us, just like Joseph's trying to recreate it in his brothers, you see. Just like Joseph recreates the pattern of redemption in Judah, that pattern needs to be recreated and pressed deeply into us. We need to walk in the way of forgiveness. We need to do the hard work of forgiveness because that is the way of God. And it's the way of the cross. There's one final thing that's right here at the end, which is why we kind of began with it in chapter 50. There where we started today, where the brothers, they forget this way of God. They forget the way of forgiveness. They forget the pattern that will one day lead to Jesus and the cross. They forget the loving kindness of Joseph all along the way. They're waiting for the shoe to drop, you know. And when their dad dies there in chapter 50, you know, then they think Joseph's going to get his revenge. He's been playing nice up until now for Jacob's sake, for the father's sake. But the father's out of the picture now. And so all this loving kindness and generosity and grace and forgiveness, it's just too good to be true, they think. And so they make up this message because they're afraid. And they take that to Joseph, and he's so sad. He's so sad. He weeps again because they've forgotten. After all they've been through, they've forgotten who he is and what he's done. And so he has to reassure them. And he says, I really have forgiven you. I'll really take care of you. And we do the same thing, gang, don't we? You know, when you become a Christian, you're in the same boat. I mean, you may say, I know that Jesus is risen and he's at the right hand of God advocating for me. I know that we're here in Egypt, to put it back in the language of Genesis 50. We're here in Egypt not because the Pharaoh loves me, but because the Pharaoh loves Joseph. And because we're related to Joseph, we can be free in this land too. Joseph is a picture of Jesus, not just in his suffering and humiliation, but also in his exaltation as a high priest at the right hand of God, through whom we have utter confidence that we can live at the foot of the King. But what happens is we continually forget that, or we think it's too good to be true. We say, well, I'm a Christian and I know that I'm saved not by my performance, but by my relationship to Jesus Christ. And yet we start to worry that we're not really forgiven. And we fluctuate. We think God fluctuates in his love and grace and forgiveness for us, just like we fluctuate in our lives and our devotion to him. We think God is like us. We think we can exhaust his patience. We think we can exasperate his grace. And we just don't fully understand how good God is. And so we've got to be reassured, just like Joseph reassured his brothers. Don't be afraid. I've provided for you. I've really forgiven you. It's really true. Don't be afraid. We've got to continually go back to our Savior at the right hand of God and be assured. And we need this constantly, which is why we remind ourselves of it and reassure ourselves of it every single week. You know how we do that? Well, we look to the cross, the way of God, the way of redeeming, the way that God redeemed us through Jesus and his suffering on the cross and then his resurrection from the grave. We connect again with the way that we can live and be free. And we're going to do that now. We're going to celebrate communion. We take a little bit of bread, a little bit of juice. It reminds us of Jesus' body and his blood given up for us on the cross. There are some individually wrapped packets of communion in the back. They look like this. If you didn't get one, you can grab that now. And we're going to focus again on the way of God, the way of the cross. We're going to look again to what Jesus did for us when he said, me for them. I'll take their suffering. I'll take their punishment. What they deserve, I'll take it on me so that they can be free, so that they can live. And we'll celebrate that, and we'll thank God for it. Let's do that now. Let's celebrate communion together.